Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. We also host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern. And this week with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we discover the theme of Exile and Return, a theme we normally associate with the Exodus and the narrative of the Jewish people in the very first chapters of Genesis. In so doing, we discover the Hebrew Bible's universal message regarding the trauma of birth, the anxiety of the human condition, and the rewards of creativity and expansion. So join us as we explore Exile and Return from the beginning. Welcome to Madlik Disruptive Torah, and every week we record half an hour of what I call Disruptive Torah, where we kind of look at the Torah with a new lens and maybe from a new angle and try to share that sense of discovery with our participants. So thank you all for joining, and we are going to start with Bereshit. And for those of you who have been listening and participating in Clubhouse, I think you already know that one of my favorite commentators is Rashi. He wrote a commentary on all of the books of the Torah, including the Talmud, the Mishnah, just an unbelievable encyclopedic review of the Holy Writ of the Jewish people, but it's not the expanse, it's the detail, and he always brings a midrash or a quotation that is absolutely insightful and actually kind of positions the whole discussion. So the first verse of the Torah, we all know, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the first Rashi starts as follows. Rashi begins, Rabbi Isaac said, the Torah, which is the law book of Israel, should have started with Exodus 12:2, the first commandment. This month shall be unto you the first of the months, which is the first commandment given to Israel. What is the reason, asks this Rabbi Isaac then, that it commences with the account of creation? Pretty good question. We'll discuss the question in a second and its premise. And he answers, because of the thought expressed in the Psalms, God declared to his people the strength of his works in order that he might give them the heritage of the nations. Rashi continues, for should the people of the world say to Israel, you are robbers because you took by force the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan, Israel may reply to them and say, from Psalms, all the earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be he. He created it and gave it to whom he pleased. When he willed, he gave it to them, and when he willed, he took it away from them and gave it to us. So, wow, what a way to begin studying the narratives of the cosmology, the creation of the world, and of our foreparents with a question of, well, what are we even reading this for? The Torah is a book of laws. It's a book that gives us the hora'aot, the direction, the path that we should walk down. Why are we wasting our time with this mythology? And then he gives an answer. But let's stop for a second, Rabbi, and discuss the premise of his very question.
The premise is very problematic. The premise is that the only purpose of the book is to teach us laws. Ramban, actually, Nachmanides, the great Spanish scholar who lived in the 1200s, he disagrees with Rashi here at the beginning of the Torah immediately. He says that the purpose of the book of Bereshit, of Genesis, is not to teach us laws, but is to teach us moral conduct. He has a great phrase. The phrase is, Ma'aseh avot siman lebanim. The actions of our forefathers are models to the children. And therefore, that's the reason we have all the stories in Bereshit. Rashi seems to argue with that. Rashi seems to say that no, it's not about morality, it's about law. And if you think it's about law, there's no reason for the book of Bereshit. So Rashi needs to explain that it's to teach us about our connection to the land of Israel. So in that very first Rashi, there actually is a question, a fundamental question about the purpose of Torah.
So I love the fact that you quoted Ma'aseh Avot Siman Lebanim, which literally, as you say, means the stories of our foreparents. Siman is a sign for the children. And of course, you could expand and say Avot could also mean as in Avot Malacha or Pirkei Avot. It could mean the most basic primary principles. So the stories of our roots, of our beginnings, is a siman, is a sign for its children. But in a sense, sign is very similar to myth, meaning to say that even the Ramban, and quoting this Talmudic phrase, there's almost the recognition that we're not just telling stories here, that either the stories actually occurred, but they have deeper symbolic meaning, or it's not that important that every one of them occurred, because the symbolic meaning is what drives us. And if you think about that for a second, I'm not sure that is that different from what Rashi ends up answering, which is, okay, the reason we need this is because these stories justify the Jewish peoples coming from another place and coming into the land that was at the time that they came in occupied by another people, and the ethical, moral, or you could even say political message, the siman that we are getting from these stories is that, you know what? No one owns anything. The earth belongs to the Lord, and he can give and he can take, and that's a bigger message, I think, for life. But really, they're all kind of on the same page from the fact that none of them, correct me if I'm wrong, is interested or believes that these stories by themselves, as a historical record, belong in our holy book. They have to symbolize something. They have to inspire us in some way. Would you agree to that?
I would agree. Now, the idea of myth is a fascinating idea. I actually spoke about this on right before Yizkor. There's a new book by Dara Hord. The book by Dara Hord has some title like Why Do People Love Dead Jews? It's a provocative title, but she has a collection of essays. She raises the following idea, which is a great idea. You know, we're all brought up, Geoffrey, with the idea that the way that we all got our American names is that our forefathers, our grandparents, came to Ellis Island, and they only knew Yiddish. So they were asked by the representative in Ellis Island, "What's your name?" And they answered "Schoin vergessen," which means in Yiddish, "I forgot." And the representative said, "Okay, your name is Sean Ferguson." And that's how everybody got their American names. They didn't know any English, so they made up something, and that became their American names. Dara Horn, the author, points out that that is not true. We know that that's not true. What's true is that in the 1930s, we have multiple court records about Jews who actually went to court in America, especially in New York, to change their names because there was so much anti-Semitism in America, and they couldn't get jobs, and they couldn't get into schools, and they couldn't get into colleges, and therefore they asked to change their names. She said, where does the myth come from? The myth comes from the fact that we as American Jews want to protect America. We want to protect the Jewish relationship with America. So therefore, that myth of Ellis Island is a much better myth than the truth. And I think, Geoffrey, that's a very interesting idea here when you talk about the myth of the stories in the book of Genesis. Did they happen? Did they not happen? The point is, it doesn't make any difference whether they happened or they didn't happen. But each one of them grapples with a moral issue. And not all of them are easily resolvable. Let's take, Geoffrey, the most difficult one of all. God says to Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son. Now, the question is not whether that actually happened or not. The question is why Abraham said, okay, I'll sacrifice my son. What right did he have to sacrifice his son, even in God's word? So the entire book of Genesis is made up of these Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim, these stories, these myths that come to teach us a moral lesson. So I think Dara Horn is really on to something, that sometimes the myth is more important than the fact because it comes to teach us something important.
I think that's great. And clearly, these are myths that resonated, certainly when the Torah was edited, put together, and then reread over and over again. These are myths that were picked for a reason, and then by simply being repeated so many times, they take on a life of their own, and you get to see how different generations and different people react and interact with them. I have to say, as an aside here, that Elie Wiesel wrote a book on Rashi. And it struck Elie Wiesel that the first rabbi that Rashi quotes is named Rabbi Yitzchak. And of course, Rashi's name is Shlomo ben Yitzchaki, or Shlomo ben Yitzchak. So the truth is, this is a rabbi that comes from the Yalkut Shmoni. It was not his father. But again, it does give another rendering to Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim, that we are looking almost like a raw shore ink block at the same stories that were looked at by our forefathers, our forebearers, in the case of Judaism, by Christians, by Muslims, by scholars. And that's kind of fascinating too. I just find that the term that the stories of our past are assigned to us is so pregnant with meaning and makes it all so exciting. And getting back to your point about the sacrifice of Isaac, another way to look at myths, and we're going to start talking about how the psychoanalysts looked at it, is like a dream as well. And, the thing about a dream, especially a nightmare, is it's made to resolve certain things, talking about it, hearing it, repeating it over and over again. And then we can manufacture the ending sometimes, so the ending does become important. So I've always thought that the punchline of the sacrifice or the binding of Isaac was that he wasn't sacrificed. But that is a story that we are going to discuss in the future. What I want to spend the rest of today's discussion talking about is something that I thought about for the first time this year. And that is that when Rashi brings up this point that why do we need these stories, and he answers with a seeming very provincial, national answer saying, well, it's in order that we should not be called colonizers, because we're going to come and we're going to, at a certain point in time, take this land that we admit we are not originally from. And we need these stories to justify that land grab, so to speak. But what it really comes down to, and this is the insight that I want to spend the rest of the day talking about, is that the earth belongs to the Lord, and we are almost, I would say it's arbitrary that we own this or we sit here or we live there. And then there's this other issue which I really want to focus on, which is that none of us belong to a particular place. In a sense, we're all alienated from it. From the beginning of the Torah, we're going to see, more than I think any of us ever expected, the theme of exile. over and over again in the first just 4 chapters of Genesis. And Rashi is even here talking about this concept of exile and return that comes up much later in the narrative, but he brings it to the beginning of the Torah. And that, I think, is not provincial, is not partisan, but actually is one of the primary themes of the Bible. So in terms of the Bible itself, we all know that Adam was created. In the 2nd chapter, it says that he was created male and female. Actually, in the 2nd chapter, it has the story of man being created by himself. Maybe he was androgynous, we don't know. But after looking for a helpmeet throughout the animal kingdom, God fashioned his rib in 2:22, and it says, and he had taken from the man into the woman, and he brought her to the man. Then the man said, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman. So here you have this beautiful image of the unity of mankind, of a man cleaving to his wife. And then it goes on to say, for from man she was taken. Hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, so that they shall become one. So we have already in the 2nd chapter the first instance of this tension between being unitary, whole, complete, and being separated. And there's almost this sense of the separation is a necessary part of our identity. Ever think, and I'm not even talking about the amount of times in the process of creation itself where God is doing Havdalah, where he's creating by separating earth from land, sky from the abode. Have you ever thought about it this way, Rabbi Adam?
Yeah, well, the idea of separating. I mean, you brought up a whole bunch of different things here. Let's talk about the last thing, the idea of separating. The entire story of the 6 days of creation is a story about separating night from day, light from darkness, animals from people, the sun and the moon. Everything has its opposite. What do you make of that? Why do you think that's so important that in the story of creation, everything has its opposite?
Well, I think, again, it gives us an insight into the biblical mind, the mind of the Bible's sense of God, and so many things about Genesis is about either dividing or choosing. And when you choose, you also are selecting one thing and rejecting something else. It just seems so written in to the fabric that this is, you can almost make the case that creation itself was not so much out of nothing, which is a Greek term, a modern term, but was this act of separating and repositioning. And it does become something that is, I think, if you use it as a lens, enables you to understand much about the different narratives. In this particular case, I focused first upon man and wife, which is kind of, the beginnings of society, separate from their father and mother. Who is the father and mother of Adam and Eve. It's God in a sense. And of course, that story gets picked up in a few verses later in chapter 3 when the famous original sin occurs. At this point, God says to the woman, I will give you birth pangs. Be'etzev teladi. You shall give birth in pain when you bear children. And your husband will rule over you, but also will struggle to pull crops from the ground. By the sweat of your brow shall you have bread to eat. And this, some of the modern day psychologists to look at this whole story as the beginning of the trauma of birth. That here man was first created without those birth pangs, and he was first created without needing to separate the crop from the earth and to create creation, so to speak. And the first story of creation is this major separation where we are thrown out of the Garden of Eden. So again, everything that we've been talking about till now has focused on this separation. You can even call it alienation, that we are torn apart. And that's how, on the one hand, you could make an argument creation happens, but certainly it's the source of a lot of anxiety.
I mean, there's no question that that's right. And, the question, well, a couple of things you brought up. Number one, the idea of Adam and Eve not having parents. But then you have the story in chapter 3 of the sin, and God really takes the position of Adam and Eve's parents in the sense that he's the one who reprimands them and he's the one who punishes them. I was always wondering, Geoffrey, the rabbis say an amazing thing. The rabbis say that Adam and Eve were created. They were put in the Garden of Eden, but they never actually slept a night in the Garden of Eden. They couldn't even make it one night. Before nightfall, they had already sinned. Why do you think it is that there was somehow a need for the Torah to tell us that they sinned so quickly? That part of the nature of human beings is to sin. What do you make of that?
Well, it's certainly the source or the kind of the intention of that type of explanation of the myth would come from the fact that it was just a taste. It was just so fleeting, and it happened in an instant. And I think that what I kind of come up with is first of all how final the divorce, how final the expulsion from the Garden of Eden was. You have these cherubim, you have these angels with a sword standing guard over it. It almost sounds as if it was part of the birth pang, that it was a rupture. It had to occur. That everything that lies ahead is after this fact, and that the story was there less to tell you about the bliss of the Garden of Eden, but more to focus you on the project that begins after the expulsion. That's kind of my read. But it's true. We don't spend a whole lot of time on the pearly gates, the beauty of the Garden of Eden. It's almost as though, on the flip side, the Torah doesn't spend much time, or any time at all, I would argue, on describing a heaven, on describing a pearly end. It's all about what lies ahead of us.
That point is such a good point, because the Garden of Eden is much more important symbolically as the place where they will go back to, right? When we say when somebody dies, Big Gan Eden, to Menuchatam, that their resting place will be in the Garden of Eden. So a Garden of Eden becomes a place we're going back to, not a place that we spend very much time in. That's a fascinating idea.
So that's a great segue for me to talk a little bit about the psychoanalysts. And Otto Rank wrote two books 10 years apart. One was called The Myth of the Birth of the Hero, and the other was called The Trauma of Birth. And in The Myth of the Birth of the Hero, he gives much credit to Freud. And Freud actually wrote on this subject in a book he wrote called Moses and Monotheism. And that is, and we'll discuss this when we get to Moses, is how almost to a T in every one of the ancient mythologies, whether it's Romulus or Remus or whoever, there's this story about the royal heir, the prince, who is exposed from the home. Maybe it's because the father is afraid that he's going to come and usurp the throne, has to go out. Many times he's put into a raft or a boat, is raised by animals or simple people. And then you have, like Odysseus, a whole way of coming back. Ultimately, if you get to the Oedipus story, he then comes back and he kills his father, he gets his mother, and all is resolved. And that's what Rank writes about in this Myth of the Birth of the Hero. But he makes a major change when he talks about the trauma of birth. And what he says there is that there's something even more primal than this Oedipus and this hero. And what that is, we are all born of woman, so to speak. We all are ruptured and thrown into the world, and we are separated from that warm place of our origins. And unlike the Oedipus myth, he claims, and I think he's right, and that's why I'm bringing it up now, is that it doesn't necessarily, or it does necessarily not get resolved. In other words, none of us can go back into the womb. He brings the cherubim outside of Eden because he does see the creation of Eve from Adam as a way to kind of detour around the birth of humans as it actually occurs. And he does talk about taking the apple off the tree as giving birth to it and separating it. And what he talks about is the whole sin, the whole original sin that all of us, human beings, have to try to address and not necessarily resolve, is this original disruption in our lives. And what he argues is that you do not go back to Eden. And I do think you're absolutely right that we talk about Gan Eden Mikem, and we talk about in our prayers going back to Eden. But Eden does not feature as much in Judaism as it might maybe in Christianity. The fall does not feature as much. But certainly there's this sense that it's something that we can't put back. You can't put the genie back inside of the bottle. That's what kind of is intriguing to me. And again, when we look at myths, some myths you can wrap with a bow and they resolve themselves. And others are ones that we just have to kind of, the human condition we have to deal with.
Yes, that is right. And you're saying that here in the very beginning of the Torah, we're really introduced to different kinds of myths. Now, we talk about myths, then you talk about the story of fratricide, where Cain kills Abel. That's very much not a myth. That feels very real, doesn't it?
Well, it absolutely does, but thank you for bringing it up, because that's the, I would say, the fourth instance in our Parsha this week where we have this sense of being a wanderer on the earth. The punishment that Cain gets is, again, it goes back to the same thing that happened with Adam. It says, if in Genesis 4:12, it says, if you till the soil, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. So this this birth process will no longer be natural. And then it says, you shall become a ceaseless wanderer on the earth. Na v'nad tihyeh ba'aretz. Then he goes on to say that I will gerashta, I will divorce you from the face of the earth. And it uses the phrase that we discovered in Deuteronomy at the end of the story. And it goes, Umipanecha ester, and I will hide my face from you. So again, these themes that we thought developed all the way at the end were there all the way at the beginning as kernels. And then finally, where does Cain go to live? And this to me is discovering humor in the Bible as well. V'yashav be'eretz Nod. And he settled, he dwelt in the land of Nod. Nod is the same word for nad v'nad. That he settled in the land of wandering.
Which means he never settled.
He absolutely never settled. He felt responsible for death. He had that guilt. And again, you can say, yes, it's a real story, it's not a myth. But if you look at it in terms of all of the narratives that we've seen in Genesis so far through this lens, in the first 4 chapters, it's all about being sent into exile, alienated from one source, ripped away from whether it's the tree, whether it's the father, be it God or one's parents, cleaving onto each other. To me, it just is so amazing that even though we're not talking about the story of the Jewish people that Rashi focused us onto, the idea is in humanity is the same trope of literally from the beginning we are separated. And if you ask the same question that Rashi asks from that perspective, then the answer is it needs to start here, because the journey is all about somehow regaining that unity, that wholeness, that completion. So what I also discovered is this amazing essay by Bialik. And it's called Jewish Dualism. And he looks at all of Jewish history. He picks up on where Rashi left off, and he says that, we've been out of the land more than we've been in it. We've, every time we've left, we've expanded, we've grown. He talks about a group which adopts itself to the ways of life of the whole world, but nonetheless remains a people dwelling apart. And that's part of the other narrative. And he talks about the strength that it gives us. And I think he wrote it in the same year as Otto Rank wrote his book. And they both come to an interesting conclusion. And that is that it's not all a negative thing. That from each expansion and contraction, from each exile and return, we enrich ourselves and we enrich others. Bialik, who is considered the poet of Zionism, even ends his essay with the following statement, which is mind-blowing. He says, and who knows, perhaps after hundreds of years living in the state of Israel, we will be emboldened to make another exodus, which will lead to the spreading of our spirit over the world and assiduously striving towards glory. So he really sees it as a pathway going forward of enrichment that is intrinsic to the biblical project. And Rank talks about artists and philosophers and religionists who are able to take this tension of being born against one's will, being cast out and separated from one's natural mother, parents, from God, from this sense of unity. And he sees it also as a potential for amazing creation. He therefore doesn't call the hero anymore. He calls it the artist, which is kind of fascinating to me. So I really do think that, the question is a good one. Why do we read these stories? It's a question we all have to ask ourselves, and how we answer it really says a lot about ourselves and the direction we want to go in. But certainly having multi-generations talk about the same texts, like Rashi and his father Yitzchak, and like you and I, and like our listeners, is part of the creative projects which I think brings us together. So anyway, I just love discovering these themes of exile and return so early in the mythological narrative, and I hope you do as well.
What a good start, Geoffrey. We thank everybody. Enjoy the Parshat Bereshit, and we look forward to continuing Noach next week. And we look forward to a great year of studying Parshat together with you on Madlik. So thank you, everybody. Shabbat Shalom, and enjoy the Parsha.